Good morning, everyone. Hoping you had a lovely weekend and welcome to our final week of lectures for the semester. Two quick things before I begin to talk about today's topic. Number one, the course evaluations are available online through the system that you do that for all your courses. I would really appreciate if you are able to spend a few minutes and fill those surveys or those forms. I cannot, unfortunately, since we're not meeting in person, offer you time in class to do that. So you're not going to have to do it on your own time. But I still would really appreciate if you can spend a few minutes and do that. Number two, as you saw in the email that I've sent on Friday or Saturday, I was able to develop an extra credit assignment for you. So that's going to be an additional survey that you are asked to fill and submit. As I said on the email, you will get 3 additional points to your final grade. So after I compute everything with your grade, your 40%, 45% final project, 20% for that one, whatever that may be with the different parts that you have on the syllabus, to that final number, I will add 3 points if you complete this extra credit assignment. What I ask in return from you is 10 to 12 minutes of serious answers. Read the different aspects. Is going to be also related to not the same as the surveys we did during the semester, but it's going to be related in some level to national security issues in the United States and all that. So just make sure that you read through those surveys and answer them with your honest opinion and take them seriously, and you will get those points. All right, let's talk about today's topic. We'll get to that. That's going to be modern technology. First of all, quick review on last week's topics. I completed the discussion about international terrorism by looking first on the different effects of terrorism. We began talking about the political effects of terrorism, primarily how that affects voting. So we saw the example from Israel, where it was mostly related to aspects of what I showed you that's related to the valence theory. So when the threat of terrorism increases, individuals will actually flock and support a lot more the parties that seem more competent in addressing those kinds of threats. So that means that there's actually more support for right-wing parties, which serves as a problem in the context of that conflict because those parties are also less likely to accept any concession from terrorists. So it's only going to fuel the conflict even more. On the other hand, we saw the example from Spain where actually it was the opposite, it was kind of a retrospective voting and a criticism of the public on the way that the government engages and addresses the conflict and the threats of terrorism. So actually the incumbent party was voted out of office. Then we talked about psychological effect, creating widespread fear and anxiety among the public, not just among the specific victims of the attacks, how that translates to different support for different types of policies. Some of them also relate to the aspect of civil liberties. How much are we willing to concede on our own civil rights in exchange for boosting national security, whether that's really the case. And we saw that for some individuals, especially those that are more trusting of the government, that was the work by Davis and Silver, those that are more supportive of the government, when they perceive high threats, they're more likely to accept a lot of restrictions on their personal freedom in exchange for more national security. And then I shifted to talk about counterterrorism overall, looking at two broad categories, hard power versus soft power, then breaking each one of those categories down into indiscriminate power approach and the discriminate types of strategies, seeing how each one of them relate primarily to the question of success and effectiveness of different counterterrorism policies. We saw that the soft power policies have a lot more promise, but at the same time, it's a lot harder to implement and assess those kinds of policies. And then we talked about all those types of different strategies in the context of the different theoretical explanation, providing rational explanations, strategic explanations to why certain policies are adopted, then thinking about the organizational problems of applying different types of policies or selecting different types of counterterrorism policies, and then also the ideological aspect. So if you have more questions about the topics of terrorism overall, if that's your topic for the final project, then you're more than welcome to come talk to me during office hours during our upcoming Friday meeting, which will be our last meeting for the semester, or over email. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about a new topic. Today, we will address the intersection of technological innovation or technological advancement, especially in the context of military advancement, along with international relations, how that shapes the behavior of countries in the context of foreign policy, especially when we talk about international conflicts. So the first question that we should think about is, why do we care about military innovations or technological innovation in the context of international security? We know from a lot of the things that we've done so far that military power is essential to the conduct of warfare, to the action that states engage in the international system. A lot of the theories that I mentioned in previous week, whether it is realism, neorealism, deterrence, coercion, whatever those theories are, a lot of them rely on the application of power, primarily driven by military power, in order to engage in different types of actions, right? So we know that this is kind of the fundamental part of some of those actions that states take. But the more important aspect is to ask, how do we, or how do states use those kinds of tools, those kinds of military capabilities? And this question is more fitting to think about in the context of different strategies, force deployments, organizational routines, organizational procedures, and a lot more. So it's not just the military tools themselves, but how do we use them? So one way to understand the role that technology plays in that context is to explore questions regarding to the acquisition, or why do countries obtain those kinds of weapons. In these studies, a lot of the researchers explore factors such as domestic institutions, such as leaders' attributes, strategic concerns, so status and reputation, and how each one of those different factors drive or explain the decisions to obtain different types of weapon systems. So in that sense, the military technologies, the technological innovation, are viewed as the dependent variable, because we're trying to explain why do some states obtain those weapons and try to take advantage of them. Another way to think about that is to use the technology itself as an explanatory factors for evaluating different types of behavior in the context of foreign policy. So for example, how does technology explain acts that relate to deterrence? How does technology explain certain outcomes in the context of international bargaining, international wars? How does it explain crisis bargaining? So in that sense, technology becomes the independent variable, the explanatory factor that is intended to provide us with an answer to certain outcomes. So that's the two overall approaches that we can do when we think about using these concepts or these factors of military or technological innovations overall. Now, for this specific research area, emerging technologies, and in the context of IR, there are severe limitations that existing researchers faces. Number one is limited evidence. And some of this limited evidence is a function of the limited exposure that we have to the technology itself. So for example, we know relatively a lot about using drones in different contexts when it comes to international conflict, but studies of technology such as robotics beyond drones is a lot more limited, because we don't know a lot about that type of technology. And there's not a lot of evidence on using those kinds of technology because they're still being developed. So we don't have a lot of evidence, and we can actually build on to develop those different explanations. Another limitation in this case is the uncertainty regarding the effects of those different weapon systems on the conduct of war, on the conduct of international disputes and conflicts. Once again, we don't have 50 or 100 years of using different types of those kinds of technologies, robotics, artificial intelligence, whatever that may be. They haven't been used enough in international bargaining or international incidents for us to rely on that evidence in order to test that and try to come up with explanations to what drives what. Now, researchers do not give up in that case, and they overcome those issues by adopting different types of approaches. So for example, one is kind of a direct approach that is focusing on the attitudes of different individuals regarding the use of advanced technologies and leveraging, and we collect this kind of evidence regarding those kinds of questions by leveraging research design such as surveys and experiments. So we are exploring all kinds of relevant questions in the context of using technology in the international system by directly asking members of the public, members of the elites, political elites, military elites, whoever that may be, and trying to understand their behavior and their preferences in this case. Another approach is to use the existing data on conflict and to integrate those new technological tools. So for example, trying to use the evidence we have regarding existing conflicts, existing disputes, or existing incidents overall to understand how does the use of drones shape the war in Afghanistan or the war in the Middle East. how cyber tools add to existing conflicts. If we have some data on those conflicts, we just add those new components. A third approach is to apply the existing IR theory to the limited evidence that we do have. For example, how does applying different elements of artificial intelligence fit into theories of balance of power? Does it change the balance of power or the classic way that we think about balance of power, and how? And fourth is based on formal models, formal theory that's leveraged the advantages of those kinds of tools, primarily game theory, to derive different predictions about the expected behavior. And that's using game theory. We do not need any kind of real world evidence in those stages in developing the theoretical expectations. And then we test that with the limited cases that we do have. So those are just different approaches that scholars are taking in order to overcome some of the problems that we have regarding the limited amount of evidence regarding in the context of using military and overall technological innovations. Okay, so let's start addressing a little bit more in detail some of the relevant questions of that research area. Starting with the effect of technological development, technological innovation on the process of escalation in conflict. So the emergence of new military technologies have led many policymakers and professional researchers to argue that it won't take too long until they're going to have a negative effect on escalation of wars and conflicts. So for example, we have here some findings from research from one of the large think tanks, which is the Center for New American Security, which suggests that new technologies such as cyber weapons or robotics will change the way deterrence and escalation, some of the concepts we talked about, the basic theories of IR, and the way that they operate in a very dangerous way. This is a quote from a former defense undersecretary, which argued that emerging new military capabilities, whether they are in the cyber area or long-range strikes or whatever that may be, autonomous systems, will increase the uncertainties, and it has effect on strategic relations and potentially lead to slopes of escalation. So overall, that represents an approach which uses a negative trend of escalation as a result of those kinds of new technologies. Now, another approach suggests that these tools should not be viewed as an independent factor that creates incentives for escalation, but rather that they play as a complementary role, as an additional tool that contributes to wars and fighting. So in that sense, what drives the decision to escalate a conflict are political incentives or different strategies. It's not the technology itself that drives it. The technology only adds to that. So in that case, based on those two arguments, we can think about the role that technology will play on process of escalation as one of two ways. One is the possibility that it's going to have a strong causal effect. That is, emerging technologies will cause inadvertent conventional or nuclear escalation when they emphasize the advantages of what's called first movers, and think about it in the context of the security dilemma. I have an advantage over my rival because I was able to develop some technology, some use of robotics as an example. I better use that before my rival develops it as well, so I have incentives to move first and attack my rival. On the other way, we can think about it from the other side. My rival developed those kinds of technologies. I know that my rival did that. Before he takes advantage of it and attacks me, I should attack first. This is part of the security dilemma and how we have the strong direct effect that technological innovation may have in that context. An alternative way to think about that is going to have a weak intervening role or a weak effect. That is, technologies will only play the role of a tool that's going to enable states to engage in deliberate escalation after those states have already decided to escalate the conflict. So in that case, the technology will only serve an intervening role which enables the attack. That's not the reason. Not because I developed certain technology, I decide to escalate a conflict. I already made a decision based on strategic consideration, political ones, whatever that may be. And the fact that I have that technology helps me in that. So I want to talk about one research by Professor Talmadge, which she's an expert in terms of military technologies. I think she's at Georgetown University. And in her work, she addresses that specific question. How does the emerging technologies that different innovations impact the process of escalation? So first, she provides us with different types of crisis, of conflict escalation. One of them is what's called vertical escalation. That is a shift in the level of violence. So they such as targeting civilians in addition to targeting military assets. This is viewed as a severe type of escalation because it violates a very clear thresholds of not targeting civilians. It increases the amount of casualties from a conflict, it prolongs the war, and it raises the issues at stake, right? So this is one type of escalation. Another type is what's called inadvertent escalation. It's the failure to appreciate the pressures that my actions place on my rival or the other way around, particularly ones that generate perceived first movers advantages in the context of security dilemma, everything that I just gave you in the example previously. This is what those examples I told you, I was able to develop a technology or my rival developed a technology. And each one of those processes created incentives for me to attack first or for my rival to attack first. All of those are fitting onto this umbrella of what's called, in her word, an inadvertent escalation. And in this context, that's the point. So new technologies, actually what they do, and the reasons that they may lead to that type of escalation is that they're going to change the offensive-defensive balance, create advantages for first movers, and that's going to be what leads to the escalation. And the third type is what's called intended escalation. That is, develop the technological tools to manipulate the escalation risk or leverage the tools to implement an escalatory campaign or strategy. The difference in this context is that technology in this case only serves to enhance an already accepted decision to escalate. It's not that technology creates the incentive by itself. The technology only enables us to engage in political decisions that are already being made, right? So those are the three types of escalations that she proposes, and she engages in a historical case analysis, which we'll get to in a second, in order to understand what role does technology plays in those types of escalation. So she focuses on the aerial bombing campaigns that the United States have engaged in Vietnam during the Johnson and Nixon administration. And the main military intervention that she relies on to make those kinds of tests is the development of guided laser bombs. That's the military intervention that took place at the time. It was late 1960s, early 1970s when the United States military started using those kinds of technologies. So that allows her to test what role did they play in those kinds of escalation decisions. So overall, before we go into each one of those timeframes specifically, the evidence that she presents in the paper suggests that technology overall served a complementary role. The escalation decisions were driven primarily by both political and strategic incentives. And the emergence of that new technology, the smart bombs technology during the war, only enabled a better execution of the American aerial campaign, right? So first, when you think about the Johnson era of that period, so overall, the aerial bombings during that time there was a clear evidence for escalation in terms of the targets that are being selected. It started from targeting industrial assets to military assets to focusing on the infrastructure in North and South Vietnam. However, the role that technology played was practically, in a way, it was a non-factor in those kinds of processes because it was still in the development stage. So the technology of laser-guided or smart bombs was still in development stage, so did not really play a role. Not only that, it was one of the main problems when it comes to the efficiency of aerial attacks in Vietnam, because there was severe precision problems. So you needed to engage in multiple aerial attacks in order to destroy a certain bridge or a certain asset. So in terms of efficiency, the lack of technology was a very important part of it. Now, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, these technologies became available to the American military to use, and they started using that in Vietnam. And that was primarily during Nixon's tenure. And in that time, the aerial campaigns in Vietnam have relied on this new technology of laser-guided bombs. That technology mostly served to enable what was called, what she calls a horizontal escalation, that is attacking new types of targets. Those targets were not available before the technology was used because there was not precision enough in those attacks in order to target those kinds of assets. Nevertheless, what she shows that and what she argues is that the main escalation of that time, which was the Christmas bombing in December of 1972, did not really rely on that new technology. It was mostly reliant on the more classical types of bombers, such as the B-52, which you have here on your screen. And that provided further evidence to argue that the new technology only enabled new type of escalation. It was not the driver of it. So the driver of escalation was any kind of political consideration by the Nixon administration, but the technology helped that. It wasn't the reason for that. Right? So that's just one of the first questions we can think about in that context. Now I want to talk about, for the rest of today, I'm going to talk about different types of technologies, different types of innovation when it comes to military technology, and how that affects the conflict behavior and different preferences of different individuals. The most prominent area that is being studied is the use of drones, military drones. I talked about it a little bit last week. We'll talk about it more now. So first of all, drones are remote piloted vehicles that have both launch and landing capabilities. One of the important advantage of them is that they can be used for multiple operations, so they can be used for repeatedly. They are a prevalent tool of counterterrorism policy in Central Asia, as I talked about last week. And by far the most dominant subfield of research when it comes to military drones is the questions of effectiveness, how effective they are in accomplishing the goals that we have in different conflicts. So to think about that, we'll begin by talking, again, a quick review on some of the things that I talked about last week. What are the advantages that drones provide us? What does this technology provide us in the context of international conflicts? So number one is the idea of efficiency. Drones allows us to get a much greater accurate targeting, so identifying different targets and hitting them accurately. Technology today allows us to use drones, and those drones can direct any kind of missile attack through a specific window, hit a specific room, and destroy only that specific room in the building. There's no need, if we want to try and target a specific individual, a meeting of individuals, we don't have to destroy the entire building where they're meeting. We can destroy the specific room where they're meeting. So that's a lot more efficient. And that also relates to the second point, which is the cost effectiveness. That's mitigating the risk of lives for our own soldiers. We don't have to put soldiers on the ground in order to engage in those kinds of operations. But this accuracy also relates to reducing the extent of civilian casualties. So if we can hit that specific window and only hit that specific floor where the leaders of some insurgent organizations are meeting, we don't have to knock down the entire building and kill a lot of civilians. And in that context, exactly, this is why it's very important, because we're using drones in a very densely populated areas, especially as part of the counterterrorism campaign. And the third benefit that we get from using drones, from that technology, is in terms of duration. They can stay in the relevant mission area for longer periods of time compared to manned aircraft or manned tools or manned hardware overall. Allows them to collect more intelligence, to monitor traffic around the area, the traffic of any kind of potential suspects and communications and everything. And we saw evidence to all that when I talked about the research last week about employing the multi-purpose drones in Pakistan, and finding the evidence in the work by Moore and Mir. I talked about it last week on Wednesday, that using the drones for those kinds of operations, not just to target specific individuals, but for multiple objectives, led to a decrease in the number of attacks, as well as a decrease in the number of casualties in those areas. So a lower risk of blowback by the rivals, in that case, terror organizations. At the same time, I've also mentioned that briefly, all the negative aspects of this technology, the criticism. First is the blowback in the context of failed attacks are primarily reliant on inaccurate intelligence, and successful attacks are reliant on good, accurate human intelligence. So in that sense, our view of drones as an effective instrument is not as a function of the drones or the technology itself. It's a function of the information, the intelligence that we have in order to implement those kinds of attacks using drones. So in that case, it's not that the drones are that much of a benefit. It's all a function of the intelligence. If we have good intelligence, we're able to execute good attacks, regardless if we're using drones or not. That's one point. Drones were not a useful tool in terms of preventing all kinds of activities that terror organizations and insurgents engage in, such as recruitment of new operatives, propaganda against the United States, even though drones were successful in some of their missions. Blowback also comes in the context of citizens in the targeted countries resent the use of those technologies and blame the attackers for any kind of missed attack, instead of focusing their anger on the perpetrators of terrorism or insurgents. So instead of the public in Iraq or Yemen or Pakistan or Afghanistan focusing their criticism on the terrorists, they're actually criticizing the United States for any kind of missed attack, which happens once in a while because intelligence is never perfect. And this only causes further radicalization within the population and increases the local support for insurgent, terrorists, and any rivals that we're trying to engage in when we're using those kinds of technologies. It also creates severe damage to the credibility of the local governments. Those governments tried sometimes to cooperate with the United States or with NATO. And when the United States engages in military operations using those kinds of technologies in Iraq, the Iraqi government is viewed as a corroborator of the United States, and there's criticism against this government. So it's a problem. And finally, I also mentioned that briefly last week, is the concerns about international laws, because in most cases, the local governments are not part of what can be viewed as the mission briefing. The United States does not notify the government of Pakistan before they engage in any kind of attacks using drones. So this is part of the problem. This research can, other than just looking at that in this way, we can also think about it in the context of exploring public opinion and how does the public view the use of those kinds of technologies. Most of the existing data originates from American samples, and overall the evidence suggests that there's a strong support within the American public to using this type of technology, mostly because of their cost effectiveness compared to using soldiers on the ground. And in all the data that has been collected mostly from multiple public opinion polls, there seems to be wide range support for the use of drones, and that support even transcends party lines. So it doesn't depend on your party affiliation or your political preferences. You support the use of drones. Now, some researchers have also engaged in using experiments in order to test more specific factors. I talked about the advantages that experiments has in order to account for more specific factors. And they showed, some of the studies show that when the threats of terrorism, for example, are mediated by negative emotions, then public support for using drones is very, very high. So in that case, some of the experiments supported the findings from the public opinion surveys that the public is very supportive of using drones. On the other hand, some of the experiments also added aspects such as the international law compliance arguments, and then there was a lot more variation in the extent of support, right? So studies have shown that when attacks using drones are described as violating international laws, then support from the respondent is relatively lower. With the expansion of the number of countries that use those kinds of tools, the use of this technology, there it is. Researchers also address questions in the context of proliferation. So some of existing evidence show that there's overall increase, that because of the overall increase in the number and the types of security threats that states are facing, for example, the increase in the number of militant groups, states will acquire a more advanced and more armed types of drones. So overall, the trend is toward acquiring this technology more in the sense of aggressive actions. So in order to attack any kind of threats that we're facing, we have here an example for, this is I think it's a Chinese drones, if I remember. This is an Israeli developed drones. So we have drones that are used not just by American military forces, but all over the world. Some of those studies that looked at proliferation also test the preferences of different regimes. So whether democracies and dictatorships have different preferences in terms of the types of drones or the different types of technologies that they prefer to obtain. And those studies have shown overall that while both democracies and non-democracies try to obtain ARM type of drones, the motivations behind those different technologies are different. So democracies focus on armed drones in terms of their cost reduction benefits by reducing the amount of human casualties in terms of their own military forces, as well as the civilian casualties among the adversaries. But for non-democracies, and especially among dictators, the motivation is primarily the option to increase the central control of the leader over the use of force. Because if drones are being piloted from a specific location area, the dictator can be in that room and to have more control over the application of force in this case. So this is another kind of a question that's being addressed in those types of studies. The last area that I want to talk about in the context of drones relates to another theoretical factor or theoretical element that we talked about in previous studies, and that's the idea of coercion. And the question in this case is, how can we apply the application of drones for some of the theories that we talked about, such as deterrence, coercion, compellence, and how would drones will have an effect on those kinds of frameworks. So the focus when we think about coercion and deterrence is that drones, the technology of drones, serve as credible weapons or a tool that enables states to send a very credible signals regarding their intentions. The advantages that drones have in terms of reducing costs and their high accuracy will amplify their coercive power and allow states to send those very strong signals and show that they're very serious in their intentions. We can keep sending in drones and attacking you if you are not going to accept our demand, whether it is any kind of crisis bargaining, whether it is move your forces from the border, whatever that may be. For us, we have very accurate tools which will create substantial damages for you. It's not going to be very costly for us because we're using drones, so we can send a very clear signals about our intentions. A related area in that is that in the context of coercion, but overall, even coming back to the escalation question, is that studies have wondered if making drones a legitimate part of warfare actually lead to escalation, in the sense that does shooting down this kind of weapon lead to escalation in conflict? And so far, most of the evidence suggests that that is not the case. And one of the main potential explanations that were offered by researchers is that because there's no loss of life when drones are being shot down, then there's no any kind of incentives for escalation. So that's what we have so far. But again, that's another different type of question. As I said, the drones area is a very, very large research area. It's still developing every day. And there's a lot of different questions that are being applied here. All the different approaches that I've talked about earlier, all of them, you can see evidence for them in everything that I've talked about so far. Now, from a research area which is very, very vast, such as drones in the context of emerging technologies, I want to go and talk about in a research area which is actually a lot more limited at the moment, and that's artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence relates to the ability of computers and machines to complete tasks previously thought to require human intelligence and human agency. Today, there's two main types of AI. The first is what's called narrow artificial intelligence. Those are discrete algorithms that are designed to execute a specific task, such as classifying a type of image or playing a specific type of game. As an example, there's the AlphaGo, which is a narrow AI example, which was an algorithm developed by DeepMind, and he defeated one of the world's best Go players in 2016. So that was a very specific type of AI example and narrow type of that. The other type is what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence, and that involves machines that have the capabilities to innovate themselves, not just to execute a specific task, but to teach itself how to do new tasks in new categories of activities. Just think Jarvis, but more than that. Overall, powerful states see artificial intelligence as a very important tool in shaping the future of international relations, the future of foreign policy overall. Both China as well as the United States invest heavily in this domain, primarily thinking about that high expertise create a lot of advantages in that, and that's going to be an important tool to enhance their power in the future. The research in that topic, as I said, is very, very limited because we're still in the early phases of developing the tools themselves. So we don't have enough evidence to actually test a lot of the behavior related questions. We're still in the phases of developing the technology itself. So we don't have a lot of real world evidence about using that technology. So we cannot study any kind of behavioral related question. Still, there's some work by authors that attempt to apply the existing IR theories to test artificial intelligence. For example, how does different types of AI affect military innovation, which by itself has an effect on different behaviors in the context of foreign policy and international conflicts. So from one relatively limited research area, I'll talk about another one now. And I want to talk a little about public views of the threats of using modern technology. And since we have this picture here from the movie, think about a lot of things they talked about using those kinds of machines which do not have human control over them and allowing them to be our protection of the world, for that matter. So I want to talk about how the public views those kinds of threats and how that applies to our context in international relations. So overall, the introduction and expanded use of advanced weapon systems, such as drones, have raised many interesting questions, which I've addressed in the previous part of the lecture, included the changes to the barriers of entry to war, concerns about civilian casualties, how does it fit into the international laws, and all that. Now, another area which is in that topic of emerging technologies is what's called AWS. This is a more advanced version of those technologies. Unlike tools such as drones, AWS are not controlled from distance, but they operate without human intervention. So those types of weapon systems select and engage the targets by themselves without human intervention. For example, you have here on your screen, you have here the Phalanx air defense system, which is very common among naval warships. So the American Navy has them, the Israeli Navy has those kinds of weapons. On the right-hand side, we have another development, which is still in the development phase. It's called the Harpy. It's developed by Israel. And this is what it is defined as a loitering munition system that attacks air defense systems. So it's kind of the counter to those kinds of tools. Now, international organizations raise a lot of concerns regarding those kinds of weapon systems. A lot of it based on the arguments that public opinion opposes the use of those tools because they lack human control, they lack human agency. And the work by Horowitz, which is one I want to talk about now, suggests that, yes, there are normative aspects related to the use of technologies, but when we think about public opinion about in the context of supporting those kinds of technology, we should also take into consideration contextual factors, and that may change the way that individuals think about using those kinds of weapons. So he proposes 3 contextual factors. The first relate to casualty aversion. So there's going to be more, according to his argument, there's going to be more support for using advanced weapon systems among those individuals that place more value on protecting human lives in terms of both military and civilian lives, because those tools are more efficient in that context. Also, if the weapon systems are more efficient in achieving victory or achieving the military objectives, they're going to be more supported by the individuals that respond to the survey. And the third is the idea of adversary use or development. Advanced weapon systems are going to be more popular when we have growing concerns as well as growing evidence that our rivals develop them, right? So this is what we have to think about, not just on the normative and legal aspect of using those kinds of technologies, but also on the contextual factors. He raises a few points about why should we even measure public opinion in the context of those kinds of technologies. So first, a lot of the international laws are consisted of different clauses that argue that those weapons are opposed by the public, so they cannot be legal. And the existing research in that context is limited, but suggests that the public is averse to using those kinds of tools, which also makes those weapon systems as less moral from a policy perspective. So we should place more emphasis on studying what the public really thinks about that. Also, public opinion in this context also has an effect on the way that NGOs operate, which is non-governmental organizations. I'm sorry, those organizations pressure on the industries that develop those kinds of technologies, and that has an effect on the access that governments and militaries have to those kinds of weapon systems. So he uses an experiment to test the proposition: what role do the contextual factors play in those kinds of assessments? And you have here the basic descriptive findings he has. So we have here the percentage of respondents, and we have here support, different levels of support, and different levels of opposing the use of those kinds of technologies based on different conditions. So, for example, when he looks at the baseline, that is, there's no contextual factors. So just asking respondents, how much do you support using those kinds of weapon systems? Overall, there's still higher degrees of opposition to it. 48% opposed to the use of those kinds of weapons compares to only 38%. That's the first condition. However, when we add the contextual factor of the protection of military forces as well as the effectiveness, then support is much higher, about 61% compared to only 27% opposition. Even when the weapon systems are defined in a way that they are protecting, they're not effective in terms of accomplishing the goals in combat, but they are protecting our military forces, then support is still relatively high, 48% compared to 38% opposition. He shows also that the results remain consistent when we control for the knowledge for understanding what those weapons really are. And in findings that you don't have here on your screen, he also finds that there's a high level of support among respondents when information is provided that my rival developed those kinds of tools. So when my rival developed and intended to use those kinds of technologies potentially against me, then there's higher degrees of public support for leveraging those kinds of technologies. So those are some of the studies that are being done today in the context of advanced technologies. And as I said, this is an area of research which is still very, very new, and it's growing every day. And the types of research that we're conducting are still developing to be more and more sophisticated over time. The last big category of technological tools that we're going to talk about today is cyber technology. So cyber is an area of research that has its origin back in the 1990s, and it got much attention over the last decade or so. And the main focus of the research in that area is how computer technology and computer networks have been weaponized as part of the overall international relations between states. One of the most distinctive features of these kinds of weapons is that they may not be, we may see those weapons differently than the more conventional types of weapons of war, because some cyber attacks are better fitting to what we may view them as a criminal activity. So, for example, robbing a bank by hacking into its system instead of conducting a physical robbery. Cyber technology is also very common in the world of intelligence, leveraging those kinds of tools to steal information, whether it is from private companies, that is personal records of individuals or any kinds of sensitive information of the company, or even targeting national governments, that is also looking at private records of government employees, but also cyber tools are used against government targets when it comes to spreading propaganda. So that's very common use of cyber technology, which again may not fit to the way that we think about conflict overall or international disputes overall. Finally, cyber technology can also be used similar to conventional tools, that is, engaging in attacks on military networks in order to shut down those networks or disable the networks, which can lead, for example, to hacking into an air defense system and to limit the operation of the air defense system. So this creates a more physical types of outcomes in the context of conflict, which may be a little bit more similar or better fitting to the way that we view the outcomes of international conflict and the different weapons that we can employ in that context. One of the important aspects of this debate is whether cyber tools can create enough risks or enough damages to be viewed as a game-changing tools of international conduct. Many political officials view the attacks that were initiated by Russia in their conflict with Estonia and Georgia in the late 2000s as evidence that that risk actually exists. Now, a lot of this debate relates to the way that we define the cyber conflict or a cyber war. If we use a narrow definition, trying to think about what are the physical effects that are their origins are computer-based attacks, in this case, this is a lot more problematic way to assess the role that technology plays, and the potential implications are a lot more limited. On the other hand, if we adopt a broader definition that's going to involve all actions that may take place in the digital world and have implications for international conflict, then we have a lot more to work with, because cyber weapons have the potential to widen the effects of war beyond the battlefield. These attacks or these kinds of effects fits to what can be defined as kind of a second order effect, because countries can have access to those kinds of tools and to engage in them as part of the overall conflict. For example, targeting the adversary's national computer network can create severe damages. For example, shutting down a power grid that's related to the national defense system, or a power grid that's related to just overall shutting down the power in New York City can create a lot of damages in that context. Another option is economic types of attacks that can have implications on conflict. So targeting the financial systems in the United States, you can have an attack using cyber tools on Wall Street, which will create substantial economic cost to the United States, and that in a way can be viewed as an indirect or a wider cost for an overall conflict between the United States and some adversary. One last point regarding the applications of cyber technology in the context of conflicts relates to the attribution problem. One of the essential parts of cyber technology is the ability to execute attacks from distance and escape capture or identification by the target, especially early on. So this is, again, one of the differences which makes us come back to the question that I had in the earlier part of that slide, whether it is indeed a game-changing technology, because if I don't know who is behind this severe attack on me, maybe it is a game-changing technology. So this is part of that discussion overall. Now, despite all those potential risks that I've mentioned in this slide, most research thus far views cyber as having a limited effect on warfare and the process of escalation. Recent studies that accounted for cyber attacks between 2001 and 2014 have tested the way that they were used in overall conflicts, and the findings show that they have a very limited effect and a very limited usage overall. It was mostly in the context of low intensity conflicts, and the application of cyber tools did not lead to severe escalation of the conflict itself. So if cyber technology does not have a substantial effect on conflicts overall, is it possible that we can break down those conflicts into a more particular aspects of conflict and find a role for cyber tools to be more powerful? So for example, we can think about the role that cyber technology played in the events of the Russian interference in the American elections over the last 4 years, for that matter, for the 2016 elections. Now we know also about the 2018 and 2020 elections. The evidence for foreign interference in the American electoral system. Sorry about that. So the evidence for the foreign interference using cyber tools in the Americans' elections creates a lot of confusion and potential distrust in the system of governments or the system of governance in the United States that is very critical to the stability of the American democracy. Cyber capabilities are also more likely to be more powerful when it comes to actions that relate to intelligence, espionage, and crimes. They can be used to create different types of economic types of attacks and focusing on more softer targets. So overall, we can think about cyber technology as political and economic instruments that complement any types of existing activity or even any types of intelligence-related activity. Now, despite everything that I've talked about so far the potential risks that technology plays, even in a more limited part of international conflicts. One of the more common discussions, I think, that exist in the general media discussions is that there is risk that can come from any individuals that can hack into the, I don't know, the grid system, the electricity grid of New York City, and shut down all hospitals, shut down the electricity in all hospitals in New York City and create severe damages. Now, the important aspect here that it's not very accurate to say that it's so easy to execute those kinds of attacks. There it is. Not every individuals which have basic hacking skills and access to the computer network can create large, significant cyber attack against a state or a big organization. Those kinds of attacks, especially the ones that we think about shutting down a power grid or shutting down water access or creating all kinds of very deep infrastructure problems, require significant skills and topic expertise, as well as operational capacity and a lot of resources. So it's not like leading a battle and a battle group of carriers and attacking the United States, but it's not as easy as using my laptop and the university network in order to shut down electricity in College Station. It's somewhere in between. We have to take this thing in perspective. The last part of the discussion that I want to talk about today is public opinion in the context of cyber technology and cyber weapons. So over the last decade, cyber attacks have become famous as the media devoted a substantial amount of attention to attacks, including the, as I said, the Russian interference in the American election in 2016, 2018, 2020, as well as other famous incidents of data breaches in the private and the public sector, such as the breach into Uber and the Equifax incident here in the United States. And some security firms are even engaged in research of those events in order to provide kind of estimates to the potential costs of those kinds of data breaches. So for example, this is from 2018, the potential cost for the United States industries because of those kinds of data breaches comes to around $8 million. So because of that. Now, one of the important aspects of those incidents, and this is highly critical when it comes to research, is what's called the user error problem. This is defined as one of the main drivers of making those kinds of attacks a lot more successful and costly. In other words, if the users themselves, the individuals that operate those kinds of those computers, can engage in safer online practices, then we can make those attacks not as severe in terms of their consequences. Now, the human failure to engage in safer online practices is very, very important part, and this is why we have to research that, because cyber attacks focus on that weaknesses and try to exploit that in order to spread as severe damages as possible, right? All of us have once in a while got this email that tells us that congratulations, you won an award for, I don't know, $300,000. Just click that link and you'll be able to get access to that award. And this is exactly the type of weakness that any kind of criminals or our adversaries are using, because we have that weakness that we tend to explore those kinds of issues. Now, one of the additional reasons why this is so important to think about is that we engage in those kinds of actions, and those kinds of weaknesses are very prevalent in the behavior of individuals, even though, especially because we're using computers all the time. You're using computers now in order to view the lecture that I recorded, and I'm using my own computer to record the lecture. So we're using computers all the time. So we should think about and understand the role that this user error problem has in overall the importance and the potential effects that cyber technology has on our lives. One minute. All right, sorry, again, somebody knocked on my door. So anyway, what the research tells us so far is that one of the main reasons that we engage in this type of negligent behavior relates to knowledge. We don't have, as members of the public, we don't have enough understanding of the risks of cyber attacks, as well as what are the necessary practices that we need to engage in order to prevent the damages. But why don't we have that knowledge? We use computers, as I said, every day, almost all day long. How come we have that low of understanding regarding the potential damages of that? And one of the reasons for that is that we don't have a lot of exposure to the potential outcomes of those kinds of attacks, because most of the existing cyber attacks focusing on data breaches when it comes to private sector or the government. And so it doesn't have a lot of personal effect on me. And even when the media engages in those discussions about a cyber Pearl Harbor, so shutting down the grid of electricity in New York City and having severe damages on, I don't know, all of New York City hospitals, or shutting down Wall Street, we don't have evidence for that as it is today. So we don't have a lot of exposure to those types of threats, so we cannot estimate what they really are. And I want to talk about the work that you had also on your reading list for today, the Kostyuk and Wen paper, and they want to test those kinds of things. But for their experiments, they're also integrating this element of the personal threat. Is it possible that if we explain it to you, the respondents of the survey, that you're going to have a personal cost because of those cyber attacks? Is that going to lead you to change your behavior and to engage in a more safer types of practices? And they also test how that has an effect on the public preferences regarding different types of government action against those types of threats. So their experiments accounts for all that, and some of their findings, overall, they show, as I suggested earlier, that it's apparent that among members of the public, there's low levels of knowledge regarding what is a cyber threat and what is really the origin of those types of technologies. And all that low knowledge, despite the fact that all of us are using computers all the time. There is a growing level of concern regarding online security, especially when the threat is personal to me. So here we have the breakdown of the effects of the different conditions. So we have here, reminding you again, how do we interpret those figures? We have to look at all the different factors here, which do not cross the zero line, because otherwise they just have a zero effect. So as you can see, the only places where we have effects which are not zero, it's where we have a personal risk due to the cyber attack. So there's higher likelihood of civilian attacks on civilian targets, as well as higher reported level of risk perception because of cyber attack. And finally, in terms of behavior, they show evidence that public behavior in the context of online practices is inconsistent. So when they describe to individuals the potential that they will face a risk from personal risk from a cyber attack, those individuals have expressed willingness to engage in safer actions. But then in their experiment, they also tested how those people behave after they expressed this willingness, and they found no evidence for consistency. The way that they did that, they finished the experiment, asked people about how will you change your behavior now that you know that some of those attacks will have a personal cost on you, and people answered the way that they answered. And in the following day or the same evening, they sent an additional email to those respondents, and those emails were defined similar in the way to those all kinds of phishing attacks, when it says, you have won this award, somebody have tracked your information, click on that link to learn more. And people actually went on and clicked on those kinds of links. So despite the fact that people argue that they will engage in safer practices, that they understand better what are those risks from cyber attacks, they did not follow through in their behavior. This is part of their findings. Okay, before I talk about the last aspect of this research area for today, I will stop for the attendance word. Today's attendance word is the word almost. Almost. Why is it almost? Because we're almost done for this semester, just one more lecture. And the final topic that I'm talking about within the context of public opinions and cyber technology, that is based on actually research that I have worked on. And that's the question of cyber technology in the hands of terrorists. So that fitting the cyber technology into national security. And the question is, do cyber attacks by terrorists are a threat that the public is aware of? And is it really a public concern? Think about the results from the study that I've talked about earlier, the Kostyuk and Wayne paper, which suggests the public is overall not too concerned about cyber attacks. The public is not really willing to invest a lot of resources and a lot of time, a lot of money in policies that are going to protect and prevent cyber attacks. Nevertheless, when we ask the public in different opinion polls about different types of threats that relate to cyber technology, look where cyber terrorism stands in the Gallup poll from 2018, almost as high as nuclear weapons developed by North Korea, and even higher for that matter than international terrorism. So cyber tools used by terrorists to attack the United States is a more severe threat than that. So how can we explain that? If the public thinks it's that severe threat, why isn't the public willing to engage in and to invest in protection? So the argument that we have in our paper that was published a couple of weeks ago is that one, it is a concept, is a function of low understanding of the threat, similar to the previous paper that I talked about, the Kostyuk and Wayne paper, but it is also a function of the way that we collect this type of information, the way that we learn about public opinion in that context. So in most of those public surveys, the question are defined in ways that how concerned are you or the threat that and that, or what is the most important threat? Again, let's go back to that slide about the Gallup poll. It says the way that the question is defined, I'm going to give you a list of possible threats and tell me if this is a critical threat or not a critical threat. And we argue that those kinds of questions are very general, they're very abstract, and it's very hard to the respondents of the survey to clearly understand what are the different elements of the threat. What exactly does it mean, the threat of an attack by terrorists using cyber tools compared to an attack by terrorists using conventional tools? So what we suggest that if we want to study and we want to understand better how the public views those types of threats and those kinds of very complex issues, we need to account for a more specific elements. So for example, we need to account for the elements of likelihood and cost. Those are much clearer indications to public opinion on those types of issues, which are a lot more complex. So what we suggest that when it comes to likelihood, an attack, a cyber attack by terrorists is going to be not very likely because there's not a lot of news coverage or potential risk for that. We don't have a lot of evidence that terrorists actually engage in those types of attacks. On the other hand, we know that conventional terrorism is likely, even though in the United States, as I said, is a lot lower, it still exists. And compared to a cyber attack by terrorists, the probability is much higher. But when we think about cost, the expectation should be exactly the opposite. The cost from a cyber attack will be much higher because, again, we don't know what does it mean. We don't about a lot of media discussions of the risk for, again, what happens if terrorists will be able to shut down Wall Street, if terrorists will be able to shut down electricity in all of New York City, how many people are going to die because of that, would shut down water supply to all citizens in, I don't know, some country in the UK, how many people are going to die because of that. So our expectation regarding the costs of a cyber attack will be much higher compared to what we already know are the cost of conventional terrorism, which especially in the West are much lower. So again, our expectation in this case is that there's going to be substantial differences in the way that the public views threats of conventional terrorism compared to terrorism using cyber technologies. So we use a survey which has a more specific types of questions about that, and we explore those elements within public opinion. And what we find is, as we expected, the likelihood of a conventional terror incident will be substantially higher to the likelihood of a cyber attack. Again, because we are aware, we have a lot more knowledge, the public has more knowledge on the probability of conventional terrorism compared to cyber terrorism. Now, the opposite trend is evident for costs because we don't know much about the potential costs of a cyber attack by terrorists. We are very concerned about that. And we think that the potential for cost is very, very high. And we know that conventional terrorism, the attacks create some cost, but not very high. And also we show in that research is that for those general opinion pools, such as the Gallup pools, when they mostly ask questions such as how concerned are you, then the measures of concerns are mostly tracking the way that people estimate the likelihood of different types of threats and not the cost aspect. So those are just This research mostly provides us additional evidence to show that the public has relatively lower understanding of what cyber threats really are. But it also shows that the way that we collect this information is very important for our understanding of the way that the public views those types of threats. Okay, so if you want to read more, as always, this is a couple of potential areas. This is the whole research area of emerging technologies is expanding every day, and there's a lot of very sophisticated and very interesting, work in that context. Okay, so with that, that's the end of today's relatively long lecture. I will see you all on Wednesday. We're going to talk about another relevant topic, and I'm also going to give you some concluding remarks for this course. That's it. I'll see you all on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.